You are on the road beyond. I'm Todd Duplantis. Thanks for joining us. Glad to have our live audience with us this night. We've got a great show for the next half hour or so. Ike McFadden, my co-host, joining me from the hills of Tennessee. Ike, what's happening?
Oh, I'm sorry. Are we doing this again? Hey.
Yeah. I'm glad if you could join us, that would be nice.
Yeah. It's all good. You know, a lot of strange things going on in the hills of Tennessee. A lot of ghostly. Yeah, you remember we were talking about the coal mine fire that I was going to plant?
Yeah, we talked about that last episode.
I didn't get to it.
Okay, didn't get to try that out. Later in the episode, I've got a news story that's going to talk about the Smoky Mountains, and I know that's not that far from you, so we'll feature that in the news. Ike, well, there you go. I don't know what's going on here. One thing that always has... the dogs just went crazy. That's what happens when you broadcast from homes, folks. The one thing that's always has fascinated me, Ike, back in the 70s, you'd always hear these stories and it would be set up like, I have a friend and this happened to them. And let me tell you what happened to my friend. And these stories would spread like wildfire. It was before the day of social media, of course. And this story, I remember very vividly because my mom told me the story and she said it happened to a friend of hers. She said late at night, this woman went to a gas station. The lights were on at the gas station. She filled up her car and then she went to go pay for her gas with the attendant. Well, the attendant told her, ma'am, I need you to come inside with me as lock the door and just get away from your car. The woman goes into the gas station. They lock the door. And he said, the reason I called you in here is because there's a man in the back of your car with an axe in his hand. Had you heard that story? Because it always happened to a friend of a friend or somebody who knew somebody that happened to. And that story seemed to go across the whole country.
Yeah, I mean, you do hear those kinds of things. I mean, personally, I'm not old enough to remember anything about the 70s, unlike you, but you do see these kind of regional variations of similar sorts of stories where, it happened to, Bob's cousin's brother's dog and stuff. So, I mean, I think that's in the realm of, folklore. That's kind of the way these things happen, isn't it?
Right. It is. It isn't, and it even made it to the big screen. It was characterized in the movie, I think one of the Twilight Zone movies or something like that. But these urban legends are a thing that have been going on for decades. And tonight, Ike, we're going to be talking about urban legends across the country.
That's right. We are fortunate to have Susan Hill with us. She is a folklorist, a best-selling author, and a speaker. She's traveled all over the world learning about local legends and folklore in many different countries and cultures. Her area of concentration is on those lesser-known local legends and the significance it has in their culture. The country I assume we're going to talk about most today is the U.S., that's where we are. She has been studying paranormal occurrences most of her life and has been investigating it for more than 20 years. She has organized a lot of large and small-scale investigations, and she says her passion is in historical research and preservation and educating people on the unknown, such as periods like you mentioned, the 70s.
That's right, Ike. And Susan has a skill set that focuses on photography, videography, EVPs, which we also covered in our last episode, dowsing rods, and the SLS camera. She enjoys teaching others how to scientifically gather evidence of the supernatural and how to protect themselves when on investigations. Susan is the founder and owner of Raven's Light Entertainment Company, and she loves photographing historic locations, cemeteries, and traveling to new locations to learn their local legends and customs. Welcome, Susan Hill, to the show. Good evening to you, Susan. How are you?
I'm good. It's so great to be with y'all tonight.
Well, we thank you for being here. I want to talk to you first off, dowsing rods. They're still a thing. And from what we talked briefly before we went on the air, but they were used to find other things besides water in the past.
Correct. Originally, they were made to find iron ore and different mineral deposits. That's what they were made for originally in Germany is whenever it started. So, And then, of course, the water wells. That's what water witching is one of the biggest things that they are known for. And, of course, now people use them to talk to dead people. So,
wow. They cover all spectrums.
Right.
What, if you don't mind me asking, what... do you know what the early history is? Exactly how far this goes? Does it go by the Roman era or something? Or where did this stuff come from originally? I mean,
if I remember correctly, it was in the 1600s. in Germany is where it started. And it was basically to find the mineral deposits. And that's what they used it for in the beginning. There's a book, and I cannot remember the name of the book in German, and I don't speak German, but
well,
I don't remember what the name of the book is.
Was there, I assume there was some degree of success about this, otherwise people wouldn't keep doing it, or was it purely random chance, do you think, or what?
No, actually, it was very interesting because even in the Catholic Church, they started using it to find wells. So next to the monasteries and things like that, so that they could have water in their areas.
Susan, I want to talk about the Urban Legend series. You've written a series of books. What inspired you to start about learning about urban legends?
Well, actually, whenever I was a little kid, I lived down the street from a cemetery in my tiny little Texas town, and we had a story about the witch's tomb. And there's this large tomb in the cemetery. It's the only large one. And I was obsessed with it. And I spent all my time in that cemetery. And I was one of the local people who would basically tell this story over and over and over again. And I've just always been obsessed with it. And I love researching them.
So urban legends, like in today, you can imagine with social media and the internet, how quickly stuff could spread. In the past, I mean, was this purely word of mouth? Was it cultural? Was it trade related? How did an urban legend in the past get around?
Yes, generally in the beginning, it was all word of mouth. And people would, it's interesting because as I travel, it seems like when I can track down origins, it was along train routes because people would travel from one small town to the next town on the trains, and then they would tell the story. And it was always, just as you said, it was always somebody saying, well, this happened to a friend of mine. So it seems like it was generally word of mouth in the beginning. And then, of course, people started actually making stories based on them, and they would write them as if they were true.
Did you notice as you were doing your research, I told the story about the axe killer, and I remember that story made it into a movie. I don't know if it was a Twilight Zone movie or something, but I remember it being one of those anthology type movies as a short story. Did you notice any reoccurring themes that kept coming up in your research? So
many. There are, especially that one. That one's well known. Yeah. There's a lot of them that are the crybaby bridges. There are so many crybaby bridges, and these stories are always generally the same. Either a woman lost her child in a creek, and now in an accident of some sort. Either they were attacked by Native Americans or it fell over the bridge, but it's always the same along the same thing. And now she's searching for her child and calling for her baby along the creek bed.
Now, are these things, are they fairly universal across a country, or is there some kind of regional variation? Say in the U.S., are you going to have different urban legends up in the Northeast versus the Southeast versus the West Coast? How does that work?
It really depends. Like, there are crybaby bridges all over the United States. It's everywhere, but and then the white woman, there's always the white woman hitchhiker kind of things. And of course, we have all of our cryptids, but there are regional variations. It seems as though, in the South, it's more of, they were more Native American attacks, or if it was the Crybaby Bridge, and up North, it's more they fell off the bridge. So it seems like there's different variations depending on the region. And just like with Bigfoot is so very different. There's some that are live in the swamps, in the swampier areas. Then we've got the Alabama white thing, which is really weird. He's white, but you would think in the South he wouldn't be white, but I guess he's an albino version. But there's all different kinds, but they all have different names, more regional names.
You talk about the crybaby story. I know in the Hispanic culture, I think it's called La Llorona, I believe. So it's given a certain name. and it happened across the border, same situation. Let's talk about some of the urban legends in various states, because I know you've gone through various states. Let's start off with Texas. You got one for Texas?
Well, there's a lot in Texas, but one that's kind of local. There's actually a glowing tombstone that's not too far from my small town. It's out towards Springtown, Texas, which is a tiny little town. And that is a well-known legend that's around here. And there's a tombstone that glows, and the story says that the man who is buried underneath that tombstone actually it happened in an accident, and it glows because because he had been electrocuted. And so that's why the tombstone glows.
Is that the Blue Light Cemetery? Is it the same one?
No, it's a different one.
Okay.
Let me ask you this, and this is going back to something I was mentioning earlier. Today, given social media and the internet, there's a lot of concern about things that are called fake news or misleading news or something. Do you think there's any kind of connection, even at a psychological or cultural level, are we sort of seeing a more modern version of folk tales and urban legends that are just spreading more quickly, or is that just a completely unrelated phenomenon, do you think?
Well, people always, generally with your folk legends, it's more, I think people tend to want interesting things to be going on. And they want to feel like they're part of something that's interesting. And that's why a lot of times it's people saying, this happened to a friend of mine. They want to be part of this legend. They want to be part of the folklore, and something that's exciting and we don't really have a understanding for. I think sometimes when people are doing the fake news stuff, it's because they want attention. So I very much feel like there is a little bit of a relationship, because you want attention, you want to feel important. Everybody wants to feel important, and they want to feel like they're part of something. So they feel like if they're putting that story out there, they may be, then they'll get more attention from somebody. And I mean, that's my thought process on it.
No, it's very interesting. Todd, I think we've come up with a good PhD thesis for someone.
I think do some research. I think you're close to Sewanee University up there, so maybe you can get them to talk to you.
That's actually folklore. It doesn't exist.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do you think, we're broadcasting this out on social media, so obviously we buy into social media.
Right.
But in my own personal opinion, it was more impressive when these stories were making it around back in the 70s and the 80s before social media, because they were told from person to person to person, yet they would traverse across the world. Do you think social media waters down the whole urban legend thing nowadays?
I do. And I also feel like now everybody is very, nobody believes anything anymore. We're all like, everything's photoshopped, everything's been, and we always try and just completely dismiss anything. All of the fantasy and the fun that was involved in it, it's a little harder to come by now. And so I agree with you. I think it was better back in the day.
Is there any kind of relationship between, as I listen to you talk about this stuff and about how stories spread and their cultural relevance and their relevance to geographic regions? I mean, is there a link? I mean, there must be. Is there a link between folklore? Does a really great folklore story eventually become religion?
Well, so I think of course it can be. Anybody can make it religion out of anything. And I'm sure that there are, because there's people that get really into certain things, and that's just, it basically becomes a religion for them. I mean, there's people in the paranormal field who grab onto one certain thing, and that just becomes their entire life. And I'm sure there is. That's a good thought.
We're going to be covering in one of our later episodes. In fact, the next episode will be covering the Black-Eyed Children legend. Is that something that came up? Is that one of the reoccurring ones that came up across the country that you've noticed?
Yes, it is. It's and it did actually start in Texas. Or well, that's the first documented case was in Texas, or documented in the United States. But yeah, it's actually they've been seen all over the world. And so, yeah, it's pretty, I mean, it's something that people see all over.
What about, I've always thought black-eyed children, men in black, shadow people could all be entities of the same, presenting themselves to people in certain ways. Is that a theory that you ever thought of or maybe heard, that these entities that people see are all one and the same?
Yes, and I have one of my theories that I kind of believe that all of those is it's some sort of interdimensional being. It's something that is presenting itself in a different way to different people. Just like you said, I mean, I do believe they're interdimensional because that's would explain why they aren't seen all the time. And they do seem to be observers of some sort.
Could we also be talking Bigfoot and maybe Greys as well?
I agree with that as well, which would make sense why we see them for a brief moment and then that's it. They're gone and we don't find bodies. And yeah. I mean, I've always believed that is some sort of interdimensional, all of these are interdimensional beings.
And are these things benign? Are they dangerous? Does it depend on who you are, who they are? What is your guess on that?
I think they can be dangerous. I believe that the black-eyed children are more on the dangerous level, just because of a lot of the stories that come along with it. It seems that they do want to cause harm to people, not necessarily like they're physically choking somebody out or something, but something about their energy brings about people dying and or having medical issues. The shadow figures tend to be more of observational, but this is just we don't know anything. This is it's we won't know until we're actually over there. But I've just never known a true shadow person to be very, malevolent. And the Greys and the Bigfoot, I'm not really sure because sometimes it seems like some of them can be a little angry and some of them can't. I've never come in contact with any of them. So, yeah, I don't know.
What is the weirdest urban legend that you've been able to come up with? One of them that you left scratching your head going, just what the hell is that all about?
So, yeah. There's a lot of interesting cryptids. And I have one and I just went blank. Oh my goodness. What his name is. Anyways, it's out of Maryland. I cannot believe I can't remember the name because it's a crazy name. No. Okay. And actually Goatman is very well known throughout the world.
That's what I hear. We had a guest a few weeks ago that told us about Goatman.
Yeah, and they're all over the place. I mean, we have one here in my hometown and it's like but the being that I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. But basically, let me just describe it. It's up from Maryland and it had wings, it had scales, kind of like a dragon.
Yeah.
It had a beak that was metal, and out of one eye, and out of the beak, it had tentacles like an octopus. And I cannot understand this, but even President Roosevelt called off one of his hunting trips to Africa to stay in America to try and hunt this thing down. So, I mean, the whole story, I was like, what is?
Well, it shows that Roosevelt was even a PR whiz back in the day.
Right?
We've been talking with Susan Hill. She is a folklorist and author. You can find her on Amazon. Is that where folks can find your books? Best on Amazon?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Susan, we appreciate you joining us on the show tonight and bringing us up to speed with some urban legends and some interesting folklore.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, Susan. So there you have it, Ike, and I guess the takeaway of that is, social media does water things down for us these days. We're expecting to see it all. I want to see the goat man. I want to see pictures. I want to see video. I want to see the goat man.
Well, I won't get into what that says about your psychology, but I noticed that, you sort of started the show talking about what I perceive to be an urban legend, the 70s. I've read stories about the 70s. There were people like Jimmy Carter, who was president. I've seen no actual evidence of any of this. I think the videos are all sort of what they call deep fakes.
Well, yeah. That's a scary thing about it these days. Deep fakes are real, man, and you can just about have anybody saying anything, and it's scary. That's scary as hell. But yeah, urban legends. I mean, we all know them, we all heard them, and quite honestly, to me, they were much more impressive when they were shared mouth to mouth across the nation, just by the old tradition of storytelling.
Well, were they? I mean, Isn't who's it called? The Slender Man? Isn't that sort of an example of an internet urban legend?
There's another one: Slender Man, Shadow People, Men in Black. There's supposedly documented cases with them, but these entities, the black-eyed children, which we'll cover on our next episode, these are urban legends, which some people swear by, and they're documented cases of these entities making appearances across the country.
I'm going to get into a little psychology here. I don't know how much you read Carl Jung, but he talks a lot about sort of archetypes, human archetypes across cultures, where you have things like the stern father or the caring mother or the rebellious son, the hero, which you see this kind of stuff repeat across a lot of different cultures. And it would be very interesting to look into something like Greek mythology and see, is there a crossover between, some of their mythology and the current versions of urban legends? Someone should do that.
Well, that last thing that Susan was talking about, the bird with the metal beak, that's first thing I thought was going back to Greek mythology. When you think about the creatures that were involved, that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, well, yeah, it could be just an expression of these deep human psychological archetypes.
Or it just could be all made up.
Well, like the 70s.
That's the other, like the 70s as well. And somebody get Ike a bio on Jimmy Carter. He's still around today. Anyway, okay. Ike, time for the news. Here's a look at some of the weird, tantalizing, and just plain bizarre stories posted from our partners at the Full Spectrum Project on Facebook. You got one for us, Ike?
I actually, not from that area, but I do have something that did catch my attention, which was, did you see that story about, it was a Massachusetts lobster diver who allegedly was swallowed by a whale.
Yep.
And then barfed up at some point.
It
And I read the original story, and the guy was saying, I was down there, diving for lobsters, and then all of a sudden everything went black, which sounds interesting. But then I've read a couple of other commentaries on that saying, whales don't really swallow things by accident and then spit them back up. And I just thought it was a very interesting story. It was interesting how much press it got.
It got a lot of press, but supposedly there were witnesses who verified the man's story. He's made it on all the news stations, so he's got that going for him. Next, we'll probably see him be a spokesperson for maybe a lobster house or something. So
what do you have?
Okay, I've got Ike. Our next story comes to us from author Troy Taylor. He's on Facebook, and you should follow him on Facebook. He posts some fascinating stories. Ike, if you remember, first off, June of 1969, a young boy named Dennis Martin disappeared without a trace the day he was to turn 7 years old. The boy simply vanished in what would become one of the biggest searches in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I know that's near you up there in Tennessee. And if you remember, we had Steve Stockton on one of our previous episodes who discussed about people disappearing from national parks at an alarming rate across this country. It's been going on for decades. In many cases, they're never found again, never seen again. Well, this case is significant because it set forth procedures that are still being followed today in these types of searches. Sadly, the young boy Dennis was never found. Dennis and his 9-year-old brother were taken on a camping trip by their father on a Father's Day weekend. Well, reportedly, Dennis was playing hide and seek with his brother, father, and some other children. Here's the story. He went behind the bush to hide in the park and literally was never seen again. After his father noticed he was gone, he said a strong storm converged over the park and dumped about 3 inches of rain. Afterwards, nearly 1,500 searchers combed a 50-mile radius in the park. At one point, 4 days after the disappearance, they came across some what they thought were footprints. On the day Dennis disappeared, one tourist reported hearing a scream of what they thought was a child. And check this out, Ike. Then they saw what they called a large man covered in fur or hair running away with something over his shoulder. Well, the FBI and park rangers looked into that story and concluded there was no connection to this sighting with Dennis's appearance. His whereabouts, Ike, to this day remain unknown. And I guess the reoccurring theme that keeps coming up in these stories is these people are disappearing at an alarming rate and they're not finding them. Some cases they're finding some pieces of clothing, or if they do find them, months later, their body is not in a decomposing state, which is also weird as well. There's just a lot of questions that remain unanswered with these disappearances.
Well, and I have a question. It's interesting how often you bring this topic up. Todd, and I don't care, do you ever abduct young male children?
No, we're not going to go down that road, but it's a strange story. And I've been hearing this story for years. Steve Stockton was one of them. And there's also David Paulides, who's a world famous author as well. I believe he was a former police officer. He worked in the crime investigation industry. Law enforcement, I should say. He did a lot of research and they're finding these commonalities. I know you posted some stuff about it, about having Germanic descent or being males that are disappearing. But it's some weird stuff that's going on in the national parks.
Well, I could continue to query you on your very interesting fascination with this topic, but I know we're coming up on time, so we'll save that next show.
We'll save it to the next show. Hey, folks, next show we're going to be talking about the black-eyed kids. All that and more, Ike. They can find us on social media as well, Ike.
They certainly can. We've got Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. All these shows are usually uploaded within a few days on YouTube, so you can watch it there if you want to rewatch it. So please follow us.
Look for us as the Road Beyond podcast. All right, we're going to wrap this show up. We'll see you on the next show. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you next time on the Road Beyond.